Okay. So if you guys remember from the lecture, we're going over containerization. And so that's done using Docker. To give a quick overview, we have Docker images, which are kind of what we would say are the blueprint for what we're running. And then we have Docker containers. And containers is where you can actually run your app.py or whatever you need to run. An analogy that we like to use is App Store is like Docker Hub. The app you download is the image. Once you download it onto your phone, that's a container. And then when you actually open up the app, you're now running that container. So then you can close out of the app. The container is still there with everything that you need to run it. And so we're just going to go over how to set that up for your code for PA4 and what it would look like. So to start, if you guys remember from lecture, the first thing we're going to need is a Dockerfile. So you'll see that what I have right here in my demo5 folder is app.py, db.py, and requirements.txt. And you'll see that I don't have a Vim folder. So first I'll run this locally like we normally would. And so that would involve creating that Vim folder, activating it, and then a lot of steps for setting up before we run our app.py. But we don't want to have to do all that. Instead, we want to create a Docker file that knows those commands and then can start up our app automatically when that Docker file gets run. So we're going to first start by creating a new file. If you see this button right here, this is the button, make a new file in your current directory. So right here, we're going to call this Docker. We're going to call this Dockerfile, no extensions or anything. Capital D, no spaces. And then in this Docker file, this is where we're going to specify how to actually start up our app. So the first command we're going to need is what language we're coding in with the keyword from. So we're going to start with from, and then Python, we'll say 3.9. From there, we want to run. If you remember, we want, turn this off. Okay. From here, we want to first make a directory where we can put all everything in our current directory. And so in order to do that, we first have to make a directory. And so the command to do that is mkdir for make directory. And then we want to call it user/app, for example. User/app. And the next thing we want to do is we actually want to move into this directory. So the command to move from our current directory into this user/app directory is workdir to change our working directory. And then we would just put in user/app. From here, we want to copy everything that's like all our files into this directory here. And so if you guys remember, there's a command called copy. And then copy is going to take in two arguments. The first argument is going to be where you want to copy everything from. And the second argument is where you want to copy it to. So what files do we want to copy here? In this case, we want to copy app.py, db.py, requirements.txt. And these are all currently in our base directory. So you can just type in dot. And then we want to copy these to user/app. So what would we put here? Well, because we actually changed our working directory to be inside of this user/app, we can just put another dot and it'll copy everything into there. Okay. So that's the first part of this Docker file. Does anyone have any questions on what any of these commands do? The run, make directory, or copy? Okay. Once we've copied everything into our into this user/app folder, what's the next step? Well, we need to actually install all of our requirements. So to do that, we have to give it the keyword run to run this command. And the command is the same thing that we always use, pip install -r requirements.txt. Okay, so why don't we need to make a virtual environment? And why can we just run pip install -r requirements.txt without doing that command python -m venv venv? So the reason is we're putting this in a Docker container. And because the whole like one of the main advantages of a Docker container is that everything gets run on the container and nothing's like on a machine. Like the containers, the idea of a container is it's containerized, so like it's its own thing. So we don't need to make this virtual environment. Instead, we can just directly install everything because we're only working within that one container. So there's no need to make a virtual environment. You can just directly install all those requirements. Whereas if you're working on your own computer and you wanted to install a requirement like Flask and you just typed pip install Flask, it would install that globally rather than in that virtual environment that you made. So yeah, so in this case, we don't need that virtual environment. So we can just run pip install -r requirements.txt. And the last command is to run python app.py. So it's cmd python app.py. Now, what does cmd do compared to run, which we use twice? Well, it's really just syntax, or not syntax. It's just that run can be used many times to help set up. And it's just for developers to know cmd is the one that actually starts your app, and that only gets used once. So that's the final one when you're all ready. Whereas run are other commands that help you get to that final step. But functionally, they do the same thing. Okay, so at this point, we have a Dockerfile. So what do we want to do here? We actually want to build our Docker image. As soon as we have our Dockerfile, we can build that image. So to check our existing images, we can write Docker images, and we'll see what we have. So if you see from what I have from 17 months ago, when I took Intro to Backend, we have my netid / the assignment, PA5, with that latest tag. In this case, we're going to make a new repository for this image, and we're going to call that repository the same. You always want to start with your username because usernames are unique, and then followed by a slash and whatever you want to call this assignment or whatever this is. So in this case, I'll use demo5. So I want to say Docker build -t to give it to name it, and then we can type in my username / what this is called, so demo5. Now what's the reason? Well, why do we want you to use your username and then / the name? Because all of these repositories are all have to have unique names so it doesn't get confused. One way to do this is to like put your own username ahead of whatever you want to call the assignment. So like my PA5 will be different than your PA5 because that username is ahead of it. So then you want to build -t, the name of the repository, and then dot, because you want everything that's in your current directory. And then you run this and it will start building your image. This always takes a few seconds. Does anyone have any questions at this point? Okay. If we could look right here at this line, which is like my old image that I built, we see we have this tag latest. So that's what the default is. If you want to change the tag, usually the tag is like what version you're on. So V1 could be a tag, or V1.1 or V2. And so to do that, in this Docker build line, you would do -t, and then after you'd put your repository name, you'd put a semicolon followed by whatever you want that version to be. So I'll show that as soon as this is done building. So it's done now. If I wanted to add a version, actually, before I do this, why don't I show all Docker images that I have? So now we have PA5 from 17 months ago, as well as demo5, which I just built 12 seconds ago. They all have their unique image IDs. But as we see, this demo5 has tag latest. Well, what happens if I wanted to change something and upload a new demo5, but still keep the old image? I could run that build command, add this semicolon after the name of the repository, and then put whatever I want that tag to be. So in this case, we're going to say V1. This is the very first version of this demo5. So rebuild, when I say Docker images, we now see we have demo5 latest and demo5 V1. And that V1 is the one that I just created. Okay. Well, what actually happens when I try to so let's say we want to run this app. So we want to make the container and run that container. We're going to start with Docker. Whoops. So Docker run. We have to specify this port 8000 to 8000. This flag -it specifies that we're in interactive mode. And so interactive mode allows you to enter the terminal, like quit the terminal from inside the terminal, rather than having to like close out the terminal entirely and open up a new terminal. And then you just want to specify which repository is the one you're running. So in this case, if I do maw346/demo5, because I didn't specify a tag, it'll default to this tag latest. So it'll run this top one of the three. And this is how I would run the app. If I didn't have this line here with the port 8000 and I just ran docker run -it with the name of my repository, it would start the app. It's on 5000 port, which I need to change to 8000. So I'll quit this and I can Command C to quit it because of that -it flag. I'm going to need to rebuild this image. So we can call this v1.1 now. This is with the updated port. So at this point, if we want to run the app, we can run demo5 and then we'd have to specify that it's v1.1. Otherwise, we just run our latest image. So if we click this, it'll start the app. We can go to our Postman. So here's the URL /tasks. If I hit send, it couldn't send the request. The connection refused. And so why is that? It's trying to reach this port 8000. So our container is running on port 8000, but it actually needs to map the container's port 8000 to your own computer's port 8000. So that was what we did in our previous command, where we had the -p flag. So with -p, you can actually like map that port manually into the command line here. So if I run this instead, now when I go back to Postman, I'll actually be able to get all my tasks. And obviously that's empty right now. This still works like any other app.py that you'd run any other way we would do it, like just directly running Python app.py without going through Docker. If I wanted to create a task called play sports, I can create that. I go to get all tasks. That's been created. Okay. Do we have any questions up to this point? Any questions on any flags, any aspects of the commands that we're running? Okay. Okay. So now, what do we want to do? Well, we want to actually start making this easier to run. Why do we have this -p 8000 to 8000? We want to make this as easy for users as possible. So instead, we can actually take out this -p 8000 8000 and create a new file that does this for us. So this file is called a docker compose.yaml. So the name is just going to look like this. So docker-compose.yml. So Docker Compose is just what these are always called. The reason this is called a YAML, it's really YAML, shortened to YML, but it's literally stands for yet another markdown language, which is just like a way of structuring just like a bunch of text. Do we have any questions? Okay. So what do we want in this Docker Compose? The first thing we're going to want to start with is we want to specify the version. So at this point, we're just going to be using version 3. Next, we want to specify the services. And right here is where you'd specify what services we are. So in this case, you could have many different services. One could be like a parser, like if you want to parse through some text. You could have like an image uploader service to like upload images to the web. In this case, I'm just going to put demo because that's the service that this is providing, just demoing. And then from here, this is where you can specify image and you'd put the name of your image. So in this case, it's MAW346/demo5. And that way it finds that image. So if you look at this command that we have, we're trying to minimize what we have here. Instead of writing Docker run -p 8000 and having the name here with demo5, we can instead put the image right here. So I actually want to add v1.1. Then the next thing we're going to need is we're going to need to specify what ports we have or what ports we're mapping. So in this case, we can just say ports, semicolon, and then dash. We want to map 8000 to 8000. That looks exactly like this. Okay. At this point, now how does this actually make our life easier to have this Docker compose file? Well, it makes it a lot easier for a user because at this point, I no longer need to run this big line here, this Docker run -p 8000 to 8000 -it with the name of my repository. Instead, I can now run Docker -compose up. What does this do? This runs everything that we previously had to type in that Docker run, that long command, and it'll do it for us using this Docker compose.yaml file. So again, if we go back to our Postman and we wanted to get all tasks, obviously, like I closed down my app and restarted it, but everything will still be working using this much simpler command called Docker compose up. Now, what if we wanted to take this container and close it down? Well, again, it's going to be very simple to do with this Docker compose file. You can just type in Docker compose down. Whoops. We're in interactive mode, sorry. So in interactive mode, you can just do Command C to quit it, and that will just like stop running your container. So if we want to run it again, it's just Docker compose up, and that starts it, and then Command C is an easy way to quit it. So now let's say we wanted to like modify something inside of our app.py. For example, we wanted to include something that, let's say we don't want to show to the web. So obviously this Docker image is going to be online and anyone can see what's inside of it. But what if we had like something like a password that we didn't want to show everyone? So that would go in something that we call a .env file. It just stands for like .environment variables. So we make a new file here. We call it .env. So env for environment. And the reason why we put a dot before it is that a dot will denote that the file is hidden, which just means like if you open up Explorer, it's not there. If you try to export your folder, this will not be included. And so we can have this .env file and we can specify what we would call like secrets or just passwords, things that we don't want the public to know. Like if you wanted to like have an admin account and you want to have a password that only an admin would know, it could get access to all of the databases, you could put that inside this .env file. So I won't actually use any passwords here. Instead, I'll do something simple, like I'll just put my name. And so the format for this is you always type the variable in all caps. And then this is just like setting something equal to whatever it is. So in this case, my name equals Mateo. And we can also say something like net ID, and that equals MAW346. Okay. But how do we actually utilize this .env? Well, first, let's see how we would run this if this was just being run locally and not using Docker. So the first thing I would need to do is run app.py or Python app.py. But this won't work, right? I never actually created my virtual environment. I had deleted it because I wanted to upload just the smallest amount that I needed into my Docker container. But if I wanted to actually run this through just calling Python app.py, I need this virtual environment. So why don't I create that and call it just venv and then call it venv. So I've created the virtual environment. I need to activate the virtual environment. And then I need to install the requirements. So pip install -r requirements.txt. So this is all the stuff that we're trying to avoid, but I'm just trying to walk through all the steps to show you just why like this env file might be useful. So now that we have everything running, I can run Python app.py. everything is oh. Oh, I need to run Python 3 app.py or 3.9. Okay, so I installed my virtual environment with like a newer version of Python. So I need to delete this. And then 3.9-m them. Okay. Now I have to rerun activate as well as installing the requirements. And now when I run app.py, it starts. Okay. So now how do we actually want to use this env file? So if we want to modify our app.py to utilize this, one thing we can do is at the top, we can add import OS. And this is how you're able to get environment files from your operating system. Let's say we want to make a new route at this base endpoint, and we can call it define greet user. And this will just use the whatever's in that environment file. So in this case, we have like this name here, an environment file. And we can just return like a hello world endpoint. So we'll just like return hello plus, and then it's os dot environ. And then in that we have name as one of our environment variables. So what's actually going to happen here? So if we run this and then I try to hit this like base endpoint, I need to make a new request and we'll call it like base endpoint. We'll paste in this part here. If I wanted to run this, what would happen? Well, it says key error name. So what actually happened here is that we can't actually find where name is. This OS, this .env file wasn't actually like imported into our app.py, so we're not able to find that it's there. And so that's just like an example of like what would happen here. You'd have to import this .env file. And when we go back to Docker, there's actually a really nice way to do this in our container. So you can actually specify that you have an env file and call it env underscore file, and then put the name of that file. So .env. So at this point, this env file will automatically get loaded in and we'll have these variables available to us. So let me quit out of doing this locally. And then I now want to rebuild the image. But if I rebuild the image, I have this whole Vem folder in my demo5 folder, and I don't want that there. So how can I get rid of it? Well, there's another useful trick that we have, making a new file, and that file is called a .dockerignore. If we go make a new file again, we call it .dockerignore, no caps, no spaces. And this file, Docker will look at and ignore whatever you specify here, and it will exclude that from when it creates its image. So in this case, we don't want to have Vem, so we can just type in Vem. And we also don't want to have these PyCache folders. So we can just type in underscore underscore PyCache underscore underscore. Okay, so we have this new file, dockerignore, and it'll ignore whatever you specify in there. So we don't want that Vem folder being created in our image. So now if we go back to building this image, if you remember, this was the last command that we used to build the image, docker build -t with the name of the repository and the name of the version v1.1, and then dot to specify where we're working from, which is our current directory. But now we're making a new image, so we're going to call it 1.2. At this point, going to Docker images, we should see a bunch of new images. We have the latest, that was the first one we made. Then we had v1, then we had v1.1, and now we have v1.2. So we want to run v1.2. So can anyone remember what's the command to run this using our Docker compose file? Try to make it nice and easy, right? Does anyone remember what the command is? It starts with Docker compose. Yep, thank you, Maxwell. Docker compose up. And if you remember, we actually have to change our Docker compose because here, this is now going to be version 1.2. So we have to rebuild this to include that the image is now version 1.2. From here, we can then just run our Docker compose up line. Oops, okay. Everything gets run automatically. That's all we need to say is Docker compose up. At this point, if we go into our Postman and we want to hit this base endpoint, if I send it, it'll say, hello, Mateo. Spacing is wrong, but it found that env file because that got imported through, through this line right here, env, and you specified that .env. Okay. Does anyone have any questions about any of these 4 files we have? Docker ignore, .env, docker compose.yaml, or the Docker file itself? Just to go over it one last time, can someone explain to me what is a Docker file? Why do we use it? Yeah. Yeah, so it helps you set up that image and you don't have to type all of these commands exactly. Okay, can anyone specify what is this docker compose.yaml helpful for? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, great answer. Thank you, Maxwell. It helps you specify that long command we have into just running docker compose up. So it helps you set up that container. Can anyone tell me what is env and why is that used? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So it's a hidden file. You don't have to show your information. This .env would not go into your Docker image. In that case, that way, if it did go into your Docker image, everyone would be able to see those passwords. So the whole idea is that this stays on everyone's local computer. It doesn't get shared. And so people can specify passwords in there without sharing that to the entire internet. And lastly, can anyone specify what .docker ignore does? Okay, so just one last time, the Docker ignore will allow you to ignore certain files in your Docker image. And so in this case, the vem we want to ignore because we don't want to include all that. And that pip install requirements takes care of creating that vem. And then PyCache we also don't want because that's also supposed to stay local on your computer. So those are the 4 new files. This allows you to easily build your image and easily start that container running so that if I'm on a new computer, I can just grab my Docker image from the web, type in Docker compose up, and get that service running. Okay, does anyone have any final questions?